GRX is Shimano's dedicated range of gravel and adventure-specific components that sit alongside their road group sets. It launched almost 2 years ago. We made a video at the time, which you should watch, and we've talked about the Di2 version before, but now we're going to focus on the mechanical version. Is it any good, and what exactly is on offer? Before we go on, let's have a refresher on what GRX actually gives you. Shimano offers GRX equivalents to group sets in its road hierarchy. At Ultegra level, you get GRX RX 800 series stuff. At 105 level, you get GRX RX 600 stuff. And at Tiagra level, which is 10 speed rather than 11, you get RX 400 stuff. Now, that sounds very simple, but you don't get every equivalent component at every level, which is something we'll talk about later. I've ridden just about every flavour of mechanical GRX. Today we're primarily going to focus on effectively the cheapest combination of 11-speed components that you can put together to make a 2x drivetrain. However, I have also ridden 10-speed RX 400 quite extensively and the top spec Ultegra equivalent RX 800 series stuff, and I'll be making comparisons throughout. My testbed for GRX has been this Genesis Quad-Affair 853, which you may remember from the lockdown builds video we did last year. It hasn't really changed since then. This bike has 105 equivalent RX 600 levers, Ultegra equivalent RX 810 derailleurs, the 105 level RX 600 crank, which is a 4630, and then it's got an 11-34 cassette at the back. The brakes are the nominally Tiagra level RX 400s. I'm going to talk you through each component individually, so stick around if you love detail. First of all, the levers on this bike. They are nominally 105 level RX 600s, and on the face of it, they strongly resemble 105 levers. The overall shape is very similar, but there are subtle differences, for example, in the sculpting of the lever if you look closely. The other really noticeable difference is the finish on the lever blades themselves, which is a sort of grippy, soft touch feeling stuff, whereas the road version is quite shiny. The overall feel of these levers in use is very similar to Shimano 105. If you flick the brake lever and let it spring back against its stop, the GRX version feels slightly more damped. I don't know if that's an intentional thing, but that should reduce the tendency for the levers to make noise when you're riding over rough ground. The fundamentals of the levers are very similar to 105 and indeed the rest of Shimano's road hydraulics. They're mineral oil based brakes, the bleeding arrangements are pretty much identical. You do need that little adapter for the bleed cup if you're coming from an older road hydraulic group set, but there's nothing that's too surprising about them. The shifting feel of the RX 600 levers is also pretty much identical to the roadside. It's got that nice snick feeling that's quite a light action and which falls somewhere between a plasticky and metallic feel. It's very, very different to the sort of snap of SRAM or the real mechanical clunk you get from Campagnolo Ekar. On the face of it, you might very well wonder why you would choose to go for the more expensive RX 810 levers over these RX 600s. There are a few key differences. RX 810 levers offer servo wave braking, which is something borrowed from the mountain bike side, which makes the relationship between lever travel and pad travel non-linear. So initially the pads come together very quickly, and then you trade that pad speed for extra modulation and power. Now in theory, that's very nice to have. In practice, I have ridden these levers and the cheaper RX 400s extensively, and I can't say that I ever missed servo wave. All the GRX levers have reach adjustment, but only the RX 810s have free stroke adjustment, so that's something you're not getting with these RX 600s. This falls into the category, I think, of nice to have but not essential. I haven't missed it on these levers, but if you're somebody that has to absolutely fine-tune everything, you may prefer the more expensive RX 810s. The RX 600s come in two versions. The 2x option that I have here, where the left lever is a shifter, and the 1x option where the left lever is just a brake lever. RX 810 adds a third option, which is a left lever that can operate a cable actuated dropper post. Obviously you can only do that if it's also a 1x drivetrain because it can't shift gears as well. An option that I think might be unique to Shimano, which will work with levers from across the range, is that you can put inline cross style brake levers on the tops of your bars. An inline hydraulic lever is pretty unusual and I think a very cool concept, but I don't have them on this bike. In overall spec, the 10-speed RX 400 levers are very similar to the RX 600s. The finish is a little bit different and there's no 1x option, but in terms of mechanicals, again, they feel very similar and they offer the same features. Let's talk cranks. This bike, again, has the RX 600 105 level cranks and it's a 2x 4630. If you're going 1x at RX 600 level, you only have the option of a 40-tooth chainring. RX 810 2x cranks are 4831 and the 1x option is either 40-tooth or 42-tooth. GRX cranks are a pretty familiar looking design if you're used to Shimano. They're all alloy, they're 4-arm design and they're based around the same Holotech 2 bottom bracket that we've had for years now, which comes in both press fit and threaded options. They're very, very easy to work on. The crank splits into the drive side, which includes the axle, and the non-drive side, which is just the crank arm. I really like the way GRX cranks look. Shimano's gone for what I think is more of a mountain bike aesthetic, whereas the road options have a completely closed over axle. There's a hole through the axle, so you can see into the crank on these. A key difference between GRX cranks and Shimano's road cranks is that the chain line is 2.5mm wider, and that means you must match them to a GRX front derailleur for 2x setups. Cranks are one of the components which don't come at every level in the GRX range, so if you have a 10-speed RX 400 GRX drivetrain, the crank that goes with that is nominally RX 600 10-speed, but that is actually slightly different to RX 600 11-speed. GRX derailleurs are another component that doesn't come at every level in the hierarchy. So this bike has nominally Ultegra level RX 810 front and rear derailleurs. It uses the same Shadow RD Plus geometry borrowed from the mountain bike side that tucks the derailleur kind of underneath the cassette a bit more, making it less vulnerable to hits. The most important thing is that it's clutch equipped, which helps keep the chain in check when you're bouncing around on rough terrain, and that clutch is actually adjustable if you take the little cover off and tweak it. There's nothing hugely new or surprising about the GRX rear derailleur, but one nice thing is that it has hex head limit screws rather than the old JIS standard crossheads that you used to get. This rear derailleur comes in two versions. This one is for 2x drivetrains. It's the RX 810 and it takes a cassette up to a maximum cog size of 34 teeth. For 1x drivetrains, the RX 812 derailleur takes a maximum 42 tooth cog. Broadly speaking, the RX 800 series derailleurs are compatible with 11-speed road stuff. On the 10-speed front with RX 400 components, they are only officially compatible with Tiagra 4700 because there's a difference in cable pull between the group sets. Shimano has really good compatibility charts, so if you are trying to piece together a drivetrain that's a mixture of new and old parts, it's really worth having a look at those. The RX 400 derailleurs are cheaper, heavier, a bit less blingy, but really good. A key difference, interestingly, is that it's 2x only RX 400 and the rear derailleur will actually take a slightly bigger cassette. It'll take an 11-36 rather than 11-34. GRX doesn't have its own cassettes and chains per se. They're all borrowed from either the road or the mountain bike side. And that means that 11 speed goes with 11 speed, 10 goes with 10, and everything in that sense is simple when it comes to compatibility. As I said, there is no RX 600 front derailleur, so that's an RX 810 front. And remember that the chain line is different with GRX, so that has to be matched to the cranks. Otherwise, the front derailleur is quite similar to a road one. It's got the same compact design that Shimano's been doing for a while now, which has a built-in tension adjustment, so you don't have to have a barrel adjuster in line with the cable. The setup for these is a tiny bit more involved than it was with older road derailleurs, so it's well worth following Shimano's dealer manual instructions if you're building your own bike. Leaving aside the chainline thing, compatibility is very similar to how it was for the rear derailleur. So broadly, 11-speed stuff is compatible, for example, with road levers, but with the 10-speed RX 400 front derailleur, you are limited to Tiagra 4700 officially. When it comes to compatibility, there is often a bit of wiggle room with these things, but this is what officially Shimano states. GRX brake calipers again only come at 2 levels, RX 400 and RX 810. This bike has the cheaper RX 400s because they are compatible, and you'll often find that if you're buying RX 600 levers, they'll be bundled with the cheaper brakes. The brakes are very, very similar to Shimano's road options. They are flat mount only, so if you are building up an older bike with IS mounts, you'll want mountain bike calipers instead. Functionally, there isn't a great deal to choose between the cheaper RX 400 and the more expensive RX 810 calipers. The RX 810s are much shinier and nicer looking, and they have ceramic pistons rather than resin ones, which in theory offer a performance advantage, but in practice, there's a good chance you'll never notice. So, after all that tech stuff, what is GRX actually like to ride? Basically, if you are used to Shimano's road group sets, nothing about GRX is going to feel terribly surprising or unusual. It's got the same nice light shifting action, both front and rear, and turning the clutch on and off doesn't make an appreciable difference to how that feels. The brakes are really good as well, lots of power, lots of modulation, regardless of whether you've got servo wave or not. And the overall ergonomics of the group set, how the levers feel in your hand, are very similar. This might seem like a slightly spicy take in this day and age, but I think that with the options Shimano gives you, 2x is the way to go with GRX. I think that for a typical gravel bike, one that you're going to take both on and off road, a gearing setup like this is ideal. Remember, this is a 46-30 at the front and an 11-34 at the rear. So that means that your low gear is a properly low 30-34. At the same time, you're not sacrificing too much at the top end. A 46-11 is actually a reasonably large gear. A key concern with gravel and adventure riding generally, particularly if you're ever thinking of carrying anything, is getting low enough gears. If you want to talk gear inches, the low gear on this bike, 30-34, gives you 24.1 inches with a typical 38mm gravel tyre. The RX 400 option, remember, goes even lower, 30-36, and that gets you a 22.8, which is a really, really low gear. Now, if you compare that to 1x, you're getting a much more useful range, I think. The low gear on GRX 1x is a 40 at the front and a 42 at the back. And that gives you a 26-inch low gear, which is still very, very low if you're comparing it to road stuff. But if you are thinking about lugging up really, really steep stuff or carrying anything, you may feel like it's not low enough. Equally, if you're talking about a bike that goes on and off-road, the top end on 1x may feel a little bit lacking. It's only going to give you a 99.3-inch gear. That's not that high. I'm sure some of you absolutely hate front derailleurs and will go 1x regardless, but I do think it's really worth considering 2x for versatility. And let's be honest, Shimano's front shifting is class leading. It really is very good. The action is light. It's very, very dependable. You don't get chain drops. When it comes to 1x, I do think that Shimano's rivals still have the edge. If you compare it, for example, to the recently launched Campagnolo Ekar group set, that offers, with its mid-range cassette, a 38-42 low gear, but doesn't sacrifice the high end because it's got that tiny little 9-tooth cog. SRAM goes almost as far, offering a 10-42 cassette option with its Force 1 group set. Force ETAP Axis offers really low gears as well, and if you've got lots of money, you can mix it with the Eagle Axis mountain bike stuff for really crazy low gears in what they call a mullet setup. Having said all that, comparing to Ekar and 4C-Tap Axis isn't particularly fair because those are both very expensive group sets. Also, Shimano is really good at keeping things compatible, at least across the 11-speed side of things, and they're also generally quite conservative with how they rate things when it comes to derailleur capacity, for example, so there is often scope to push the limits a bit. And then, of course, you can look to the aftermarket if you want to go more extreme, for example, running much smaller chain rings. My takeaway from riding just about every version of GRX Mechanical is that they are all excellent, and actually perhaps the one that surprised me most was 10-speed RX 400, which is very, very good and gives up so little to its fancier, blingier 11-speed counterparts. If you're coming from a road group set and you're thinking of sharing wheels or mixing and matching components, it's likely that 11-speed will be the better option for you. But if you're buying a new bike and don't want to splash out loads of money, really do consider RX 400 because it's excellent. If you're still watching at this point, you're probably a genuine group set nerd, and for your benefit, I'm going to talk about weights. In time-honoured tradition, I'm going to have to refer to my notes because I can't keep that many numbers in my head at once. The claimed weights for GRX are all on BikeRadar, and I do recommend that you refer to our excellent website for those. But I weighed the components on this bike as I built it, and so that's what I'm going to tell you. The RX 600 levers weighed 305 grams for the right and 316 grams for the left. Remember, that's the 2x version. The RX 810 rear derailleur was 252 grams. The front derailleur was 96 grams. The cranks, including chain rings for a 170mm crank arm, were 808 grams. The threaded bottom bracket, which is an Ultegra level 1, was 76 grams. The HG 700 11 to 34 cassette was 362 grams, including the spacer for an 11-speed free hub. Chain was 257 grams, and the brakes were 121 grams for the front caliper only, and 166 grams for the rear caliper, which included some hose, which is a very unhelpful thing for me to do. I'm also going to talk about pricing. Now, group set pricing is really annoying because often the retail numbers bear very little resemblance to how much you actually pay for components when you go and order them from a bike shop. Also, they're often totally divorced from how much the bikes with those components cost. However, I'm sure you want to know that the components on this bike I priced up at £937.92. That sounds like a lot, and I don't think it's particularly meaningful, but I wanted to give you a measure of where we're at. You should expect to see components like this, so a mix of RX 600, RX 810, that sort of level, on bikes starting at around £1,600 in the UK, or maybe about $2,000 US. Ultimately, Shimano GRX is not earth-shatteringly surprising, new or different, but it's very, very good at what it does, and it offers options that will suit a huge number of riders. If you're thinking about speccing a gravel bike, I think it's a really compelling option, particularly at the lower end, where I think it's better than the options from key rivals. It's fair to say that on the 1x side, it's not as strong, and that will put some of you off, but if you are happy particularly with a 2x drivetrain, I think GRX really has something going for it. Please let me know your thoughts about GRX, about how I've spec'd this bike, and about how stylish I look in this waxed cotton coat. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and hit that little bell icon so that every time we post a scintillating video like this, you get a notification.